Famous pianist told a blind black boy to play piano as a joke. He has an incredible gift. Hey kid, how about playing something for us? I bet you know. Happy birthday. The voice of famous pianist Vincent Sterling echoed through the grand hall of the Lincoln Art Center, eliciting muffled laughter from the guests of New York's musical elite. David Thompson, only 16, stood motionless beside the Steinway grand piano. His hands clutched his white cane tightly as an awkward silence filled the room. The boy had arrived with his public school music teacher who had managed to get 2 tickets to the most exclusive charity recital of the season. Vincent adjusted his Armani tuxedo and smiled at the audience of patrons and music critics. At 42, he was considered one of the greatest Chopin interpreters of our time, with sold-out world tours and million-dollar contracts. To him, that misplaced boy represented everything that was wrong with the policies of inclusion in cultural events. Come on, don't be shy, Vincent insisted, his voice dripping with condescension. I'm sure our generous donors would love to see how we invest in diversity. Ms. Patricia Wells, director of the organizing foundation, muttered something about inappropriate to her assistant, but did not intervene. After all, Vincent Sterling was the star of the evening, responsible for raising millions for the institution. David took a deep breath, his fingers tightening around his cane. No one there knew that he spent 8 hours a day practicing on a borrowed keyboard in the basement of the neighborhood church. No one knew that at the age of 3 he could reproduce entire symphonies after hearing them only once. And most importantly, no one imagined that at that moment, while everyone saw him as an inconvenient obstacle, he was memorizing every note, every chord, every nuance of the arrogance that hung in the air. Actually, David said, his calm voice cutting through the murmur of parallel conversations, I prefer Bach. Vincent let out a genuine laugh. Bach, really? What piece could you play, young man? The famous pianist's smile was about to freeze on his face when David replied, with a serenity that only exists in those who carry a secret too powerful to be revealed before the right time. Partita number 2 in C minor. But perhaps it's a little too advanced for this audience. The silence that followed was so thick you could hear the ticking of the old clock in the entrance hall. There was something about the way that boy stood, the quiet confidence of his words, that made some of the guests realize they were about to witness something far beyond simple humiliation. If you're enjoying this story of overcoming prejudice, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to find out how a moment of mockery would turn into the most devastating lesson the New York musical elite would ever receive. Vincent Sterling felt a twinge of irritation at the boy's unexpected response. The Partita number 2 in C minor was one of Bach's most technically and emotionally complex compositions, known for breaking experienced pianists. How dare this kid suggest that the audience wasn't up to it? Too advanced, Vincent repeated, his voice taking on a sharper tone. Young man, you're speaking to people who finance the world's greatest orchestras. Perhaps you don't understand where you are. The audience murmured in agreement. Margaret Rothschild, heiress to a banking dynasty and the foundation's principal patron, whispered to her companion, how rude. Someone needs to teach this generation some manners. David remained motionless, but something in the way he held his cane changed. Subtly, his fingers were no longer trembling. On the contrary, they were completely relaxed, like those of a surgeon before a delicate operation. Vincent interjected. Drive. Harrison Webb, conductor of the Boston Symphony Orchestra. Perhaps we should continue with the main program. No, Vincent cut in, now clearly irritated by the perceived insubordination. Young David here seemed to question the sophistication of our guests. I think it's only fair that he demonstrate this musical superiority he's implying. Vincent walked over to the piano and played the first few bars of the partita with exaggerated, almost theatrical movements. You see, David, this is a piece that requires not only technique, but emotional maturity, something that takes decades to develop. Are you sure you want to expose yourself like this? What Vincent didn't know was that David knew every nuance of that performance. For the past 8 years, since he lost his sight in a car accident that also took his parents, he had devoted every free moment to music, not as a hobby or because of natural talent, but out of necessity. It was his only way of processing pain that words couldn't reach. His Aunt Deborah, who worked as a cleaning lady at the city's music conservatory, had gained access to rare recordings in Braille sheet music. David had memorized hundreds of pieces, studying not only the notes, but the historical interpretations, the regional variations, the emotional contexts of each composer. Dr. Sterling, David said, deliberately using the wrong title. You played the first few bars in D major. Partita number 2 is in C minor. An icy silence descended on the room. Vincent felt the blood rush to his face. He had deliberately changed the key to test whether the boy really knew the piece. But he hadn't expected to be corrected in public. Obviously, it was intentional. Vincent lied, his voice losing its polished smoothness. I was testing his basic musical ear. I see, David replied with a calmness that made some of the guests shift uncomfortably in their chairs. Then you must also know that Bach composed this part after the death of his first wife, Maria Barbara. Each movement reflects a stage of mourning. That's why playing it correctly requires more than technique. It requires having known real loss. The statement hit Vincent like a punch in the stomach. His own interpretation of the piece had always been technically perfect, but cold, lacking the emotional depth that true connoisseurs always noticed, but never dared to comment on. Very good, Vincent said, his mask of superiority beginning to crack. Since you're so knowledgeable about music theory, how about showing us in practice? Or would you rather continue impressing us with your encyclopedic knowledge? David approached the piano, leaving his cane leaning carefully against the bench. His hands found the keys with the precision of someone who had mapped thousands of keyboards in his mind. One question before I begin, David said, turning slightly toward the audience. Has anyone here ever lost everything they loved in a single moment, and had to rebuild their soul note by note? The silence that followed was different. It was no longer one of social discomfort, but of recognition. Some guests began to realize that they were witnessing something much deeper than a simple musical demonstration. Vincent felt a chill of apprehension. There was something about the boy's posture, the way his hands hovered over the keys, that suggested the evening would not follow the humiliating script he had planned. What those privileged people couldn't see was that every condescending word, every pitying glance, every attempt to belittle him, was feeding something much more powerful than indignation. It was awakening the kind of strength that only comes from suffering transformed into purpose. And David was about to show that underestimating someone who has lost everything is the most dangerous mistake one can make. David's question hung in the air like a suspended note, creating an uncomfortable silence that made some guests shift in their seats. Vincent felt a growing irritation at the boys' continued insubordination. Enough cheap philosophy, Vincent cut in, his voice completely losing its social politeness. Either you play now or you leave so we can get on with a serious program for the evening. Margaret Rothschild whispered loudly enough to be heard. Honestly, I don't know why we allow anyone into these events. There is a standard to be maintained. David nodded, slowly, his hands still hovering over the keys. You're right about standards. They're really important. His voice carried a calmness that made Drive Webb frown, as if he sensed something the others couldn't yet pick up on. In the fifth row, Deborah Thompson immediately recognized the tone in her nephew's voice. It was the same one he used before solving impossible math problems, or when he was about to demonstrate something he'd been preparing in secret. She had worked at the conservatory long enough to know that David wasn't just talented, he was prodigious in a way that few understood. David, Vincent insisted, now clearly losing patience. Are you going to play or not? Because I can guarantee that no one here has all night for your existential musings. Actually, David replied, adjusting his position on the bench, I'd like to make a small change to the proposal. Instead of partita number 2, how about something more educational for the audience? Vincent laughed contemptuously. Educational? Kid, you're talking to people who fund entire conservatories. What exactly could you teach us? David turned slightly toward the audience, his blind eyes seeming to see through the social masks everyone wore. How about demonstrating the difference between playing notes correctly and playing music? A murmur ran through the audience. Some guests exchanged puzzled glances while others seemed offended by the implication. How dare he? Patricia Wells muttered to her assistant, as if someone like him could distinguish between superior technique and whatever he thinks he can do. Vincent felt himself losing control of the situation. This kid was clearly trying to manipulate the audience, create some kind of dramatic moment. It was time to end this charade once and for all. Very well, Vincent said, walking over to the piano. Since you want to give a lesson, I'll demonstrate first how the parta should be played by someone who has actually studied music. David stepped away from the bench, allowing Vincent to sit down. What the famous pianist didn't notice was the almost imperceptible smile that crossed the boy's face, not one of nervousness, but of someone who had just put his opponent exactly where he wanted him. Vincent began to play with his usual technical precision. Every note was in the right place, every beat perfectly measured. It was an impressive display of musical skill, developed over decades of formal training. As Vincent played, David closed his eyes and did something he had learned years ago. He memorized not just the notes, but every nuance of the interpretation, every stylistic choice, every micro pause. In his mind, he was photographing the entire performance, cataloging every element he could use against his opponent. Deborah watched her nephew with a mixture of pride and apprehension. She knew that concentration, it was the same one David displayed when he spent hours studying recordings of masters long dead, analyzing their interpretations like a detective examining evidence. Dr. Webb, sitting in the third row, also noticed something different about the boy's posture. There was a quietness about him that reminded him of the great performers before career-defining performances, a calmness that came not from resignation, but from absolute preparation. Vincent finished the parta with a dramatic flourish, clearly pleased with himself. The audience applauded politely, some commenting on his flawless technique and mature interpretation. And now, Vincent said, rising and gesturing grandly toward the piano, let's see how you interpret this piece. That is clearly beyond your capabilities. David approached the bench again, but before sitting down, he did something unexpected. He turned to the audience and said, before I begin, I'd like you to know something about the music you just heard. Vincent frowned. What are you talking about? The partita number 2 was not written merely as a technical exercise, David continued, his voice taking on an authority that made the entire room pay attention. Bach composed it as a dialogue with grief. Each movement represents a different phase of mourning for the loss of his wife, Maria Barbara. Some guests leaned forward, intrigued by the change in tone. The first movement, David continued, represents denial. The music refuses to accept the reality of the loss. The second is anger against God, against fate, against the music itself, for failing to bring the dead back to life. Vincent rolled his eyes. Any first-year student knows that you're not impressing anyone with basic historical context. David smiled again, but this time the smile reached his eyes. You're right. Historical context is easy to memorize, but to experience that pain Personally, that changes everything. He sat down at the piano and placed his hands on the keys. The difference, Drive, Sterling, between your interpretation and mine is not technical. It's that you played the notes Bach wrote. I'm going to play the tears he shed. The silence that followed was unlike any of the previous ones. There was an electric expectation in the air, as if everyone sensed they were about to witness something extraordinary. In the fifth row, Deborah clenched her fists. She knew David wasn't just about to play music. He was about to bare his soul to strangers who had spent the entire evening underestimating him. It was brave and terrifying at the same time. Vincent remained standing next to the piano, his expression oscillating between irritation and growing apprehension. There was something about the way the boy stood, the quiet confidence of his movements that suggested the night would not end as he had planned. David took a deep breath and closed his eyes. In his mind, he was no longer in that room full of people who despised him. He was back to that terrible day 8 years ago when he woke up in the hospital and discovered that he would never see his parents' faces again, that he would never see anything again. When his hands touched the first notes of the partita, something magical happened in the hall. It wasn't just the same notes Vincent had played minutes before. It was the same notes, transformed by lived experience, by real pain, by genuine loss that had shaped every fiber of David's being. That's when everyone realized they had completely underestimated this blind boy. From the outskirts, not just his technical ability, but the emotional depth he carried within him, and that he was about to use every ounce of accumulated suffering to transform his humiliation into something none of them would ever forget. The first notes that emerged from the piano made Vincent Sterling involuntarily recoil. They weren't just the same notes he had played minutes before. They were the same notes transfigured by a soul that had known darkness and found light in music. David played the partita as if he were talking directly to Bach across the centuries. Each musical phrase carried the weight of his own experience, the brutal denial of loss at the age of 8, the anger against a world that saw him only as an obstacle, and finally the transformative acceptance that had shaped his sacred relationship with music. My God, whispered Drive Webb, leaning forward in his chair. In his 40-year musical career, he had never heard a performance with such emotional depth. Vincent felt his legs tremble. The boy's technique was not only flawless, it was superior to his own. The passages he had played with concentrated effort flowed from David's fingers like crystal clear water, as natural and inevitable as breathing. Margaret Rothschild, who minutes earlier had scoffed at the boy's audacity, now had tears streaming down her carefully made UP cheeks. David's music wasn't just technically perfect, it was transformative, touching places in her soul she had forgotten existed. How is this possible? Patricia Wells whispered to her assistant, her voice trembling with genuine emotion. The answer came in the form of the music itself. David wasn't just playing the parta, he was retelling his story through it. The first movement became the narrative of a child who lost everything in an instant. The second, the rage of a teenager, forced to navigate a world that saw him as inferior before it even knew him. Vincent watched, paralyzed, as his own interpretation was systematically dismantled and rebuilt into something infinitely more powerful. Every musical choice he had made for decades, technically correct, but emotionally empty, was being exposed by the raw genius of the boy he had tried to humiliate. When David reached the third movement, something extraordinary happened in the room. The movement that represents acceptance and transcendence in Bach's philosophy took on an almost spiritual dimension. David was no longer playing for the audience. He was playing through them, connecting every person in the room to the universal experience of loss and rebirth. Vincent, whispered Drive Webb, his voice heavy with awe. This boy, he is one of the greatest natural talents I have ever witnessed. Vincent felt something shatter inside his chest. It wasn't just his pride. It was the entire structure of superiority he had built up over his lifetime. This blind, black kid from the projects wasn't just better than him. He was better than any pianist Vincent had ever known. The entire room was now completely silent, except for the transcendent music flowing from the piano. People who had come there to flaunt their social status were now confronted with something genuine and too powerful to be ignored or diminished. David approached the climax of the partita, and it was then that Vincent realized the full extent of his own arrogance. Every movement of the boy revealed years of intensive study, fierce discipline, and an understanding of music that transcended formal education. This was not amateur talent. This was musical genius that had been forged in adversity. He memorized our entire conversation, Vincent muttered to himself, the realization hitting him like a bolt of lightning. Every condescending tone, every word of contempt. He knew exactly what he was doing. Deborah Thompson in the fifth row smiled through her tears. She had watched David practice until his hands bled, study Braille sheet music late into the night, memorize interpretations of masters long dead. Now finally, the world was witnessing what she had always known existed. Vincent looked around the room and saw his own destruction reflected in the faces of the musical elite. Margaret Rothschild watched him with an expression that mixed disappointment and disgust. Dr. Webb shook his head slowly, clearly re-evaluating everything he thought about Vincent Sterling. "How dare you?" Patricia Wells whispered, her gaze fixed on Vincent. "Tried to humiliate a child with such an extraordinary gift." Vincent tried to form a response, but the words died in his throat. There was no explanation that could justify what he had done. He had tried to use his privileged position to crush a boy who represented everything music should be: pure, honest, and transformative. David concluded the partita with a delicacy that made the silence that followed seem sacred. His hands remained on the keys for a moment, as if sealing a pact with the music he had just unleashed. When he finally stood up and turned to face the audience, there was no arrogant triumph on his face, just the quiet dignity of someone who had shared his soul and knew he had honored both Bach and his own journey. The ovation that followed was unlike anything that room had ever witnessed. It wasn't just applause. It was simultaneous recognition, apology, and celebration. People rose as if they were in the presence of something divine. Vincent stood motionless,